Sure. Let us start this webinar. Welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar. The topic of the day will be what exchange rate regime for Lebanon, and this is part of our economic policy series, which is organized by AUB's American University of Beirut Economics Department with the Issam Faris Institute. And it's virtual this time because many people like me are traveling at this time of the year. Uh, we met in the past few months on several topics. We met on taxation and fiscal policy. We met on the cost of the ongoing war. We met on the GAP law, the bank restructuring law. The last meeting was about using or not using gold. And we will continue meeting in the months ahead with issues at the heart of policy making in Lebanon. So I will moderate this session. I'm Ishac Diwan. I'm professor of practice in economics at AUB and director for research at the Finance for Development Lab at the Paris School of Economics. So let me say a few words to introduce the topic of the day. What exchange rate regime for Lebanon? Before 1990, the Lebanese pound floated in a dirty way, but it floated. After 1990 until 2019, the pound was, however, pegged to the dollar, and that's a regime that facilitated sustained capital inflows. The arrangement collapsed in 2019 at great cost. Since then, as you know, the banking system has been illiquid, largely insolvent, and Lebanon has effectively become a cash-based, highly dollarized economy. So as reform efforts begin to take shape, attentions is starting to turn to the question of the preferred future currency regime, one that is able to anchor the stabilization, to support recovery, and to underpin a shift towards a more productive growth model. A very important theme of today, a future regime that could really underpin a more productive model that could be based on export and productivity and value added. Now, in the past 2 weeks, several meetings have already discussed one particular candidate regime, that of the currency board. We will talk about currency boards today, but we want to take a broader approach and discuss the pros and cons of the main type of arrangements in view of Lebanon's specificity, the two extremes being a fixed exchange rate and a flexible exchange rate, and their variants, dollarization, currency board for fixed rates, or a dirty float as opposed to a very flexible exchange rate. So these are somewhat new debates for Lebanon. So this seminar should not just present point of views, I'm telling our speakers, but also play a pedagogical role. So I've spoken too much. Let me introduce the great experts on the matter, the wonderful speakers that we have today. Let me start with Patrick Honahan, all doctors. Patrick Honahan is a financial and macroeconomist, now at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. He was the governor of the Central Bank of Ireland during their financial crisis. And I would add, in our youth, he was a colleague of mine at the World Bank. Next, by alphabetical order, is Ibrahim Jamali, associate professor of finance at the Olayan School of Business at AUB. Then we have Ugo Panizza, professor of economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And finally, we have Nada Mora, who teaches at the Lebanese University, all very well-known macroeconomists and financial experts. So to frame very rapidly the hour, we're going to start a little bit with theory, move to Lebanese specificities, discuss the pros and cons of each regime to figure out where we should be heading, and also to think a little bit about who decides what regime is ideal for the future. So let me start very quickly with a quick tour de table to hear the prior of each one of our speakers. And we'll check again at the end of the session to see if they have shifted their opinions. So please, in very telegraphic style, can you take a minute or two each to tell us, and we'll go over the detail over the next hour, but what's your a priori preference for an exchange rate regime for Lebanon? Not why, just what is it? So let's start with you, Nada. Nada.
Sure, you're putting us on the spot with not giving any explanation. Thank you for inviting me. So, um, I was going to start with a quote I saw when I was reviewing the literature again that I thought applied very well. That exam questions in economics remain the same every year, only the answers change. And I think this is very on topic for this whether to fix or to float. So my answer has actually changed. The exam question is still the same. So when I wrote about the financial crisis in 2019, 2020, I recommended a flexible exchange rate. As an economist, why should we constrain ourselves, monetary policy, economic adjustment, and get rid of the exchange rate and interest rate instruments? By fixing, right? And we also saw the speculative attack risk, and we saw that people didn't properly internalize the currency risk that they were taking. So there were many reasons. You didn't let us really go into them. Okay, so now after 7 years, I would say if I had to just give, a short answer, is that we've seen, yes, we've had the large nominal depreciation. But we did not see, even in the short run, the benefits that accompany that in other countries, the export booms. We can talk more later about the nominal versus real
Sure.
appreciation and the reason for maybe what's going on and people's preferences in Lebanon. So I would just say that it's clear that there's a strong preference by people in Lebanon. Anecdotally, one of the few things people all, I think, unanimously agree on, maybe except economists, but they would like to have, they're very happy with a fixed exchange rate. They see flexible as associated with bad times. The instability of the 1980s, the more recent instability. And so you really need buy-in by the public. And to summarize, therefore, in further reflection, I think either currency regime, any type of currency regime, is compatible with good economic performance. The more important thing, is to have good policy and a sound financial system. So we can talk more about that later.
Thanks, Nada. We have a whole hour, and you already gave us the conclusion. But so you in the past, just to summarize, you thought the flex was best, and now you think after the experience of the past few years that after all maybe a fix works for Lebanon. Let's go quickly, and please, just with your priors, we'll discuss all this. We have a full hour. Ugo, what's your preference?
So my preference, and I am on record on this, when we wrote the paper with Ricardo Hausman and Carmen Reinhardt about Lebanon, I think that Lebanon should adopt dollarization. When I mean dollarization, I mean some other country's currency. It could be the euro or whatever. So
Okay.
a super fix.
So 2-0 already for the fix and a super fix. Patrick, what do you say?
Okay, well, looking at Lebanon's situation now, 6-7 years after the crisis, it's not a strong basis to build anything really substantially new on. There's a discredited currency, that's the reality, and it's a largely dollarized financial system, largely dollarized economy. There's a whole lot of unresolved defaulted debt, which hasn't been worked out. So that's not a good basis for launching anything big and new, new currency. So I think over, 5-10 year horizon, you could stay with the de facto dollar system with funny bits and pieces of local currency on the side, but that's a little bit of a fragile system as well. So I think I probably end up where Ugo is, that just convert all the existing Lebanese pound contracts and the cash into dollars and work on that basis going forward for the next 5-10 years. Afterwards, when trust is rebuilt, you can do something else.
3-0. Ibrahim, is going to have to carry a lot of weight on your back this afternoon. What's your opinion?
Happy
and just to remind you, we'll take your opinion, then I'm going to ask Ugo to give us some theory so that we have some tools to think about one versus the other. And then I'll probably come back to you so that you can support your minority view with some arguments. So what's your view?
So you already know it's a minority view. So
I guess, I
yeah.
can guess.
So I basically am for a flexible exchange rate regime, even if we aspire to it. So I completely understand and appreciate all of the arguments made by Ugo, Nada, Patrick, excellent arguments. I don't think it's realistic to have a flexible exchange rate tomorrow. It's going to be in the making for the next 5, maybe 10 years. But I believe that Lebanon should aspire to have a flexible exchange rate regime for all of the theoretical and even practical reasons. So in my view, I think the fixed exchange rate regime is to be blamed for the bulk of the losses in the financial sector. And we have been really contending with those losses for the last 5, 6 years. It's been incredibly difficult to move past them, to restructure the banking sector. So any return to that status quo would be extremely detrimental to the country. Therefore, I'm for a flexible exchange rate regime.
Okay, so we have our priors. We'll see where the discussion take us. Ugo, as I said, give us a bit of analytical frame. What are the pros and cons? I mean, we have many countries with float, the US, Europe. We have quite a few countries with fixed rates that collapses sometimes or that doesn't collapse. We have some countries that have dollarized, some are with a currency board. So there's clearly a multitude of possibilities. Does it depend on the specificities of the countries, on their circumstances, on a political choice? How do you teach this stuff? What do you?
Okay, I will not talk about politics, but let me start with something that has nothing to do about exchange rate. Let's suppose you ask me, Ugo, somebody needs to go from point A to point B, which are 20 kilometers apart. And your objective is to get there as fast as you can. Is it better to go by car or to walk? And my answer will be, it depends. Number one, do you know how to drive a car? Because if you don't know how to drive a car, you might just crash and never get there. Second point is between point A and point B, is there a road or you have to cross a forest? Again, if there is a road and you can drive, the car is a good idea. If there is a forest, you're going to go faster walking because you cannot go with the car through the forest. And the exchange rate is a little bit the same thing. If you have the right conditions, that is, you can drive and there is a road, a floating exchange rate is better. It's better because it gives you more flexibility. It gives you a policy tool. You can react to shocks. So a shock hits you, you can adopt an expansionary monetary policy, the currency depreciates a little bit, and this stimulates the economy, and it helps you to go back to a full employment equilibrium. So if you're in a country, let's suppose the country where I live is a small open economy, Switzerland. Switzerland has a floating exchange rate. It works very well. But Switzerland is a place which, a long history of low inflation, strong institutions, high income. So to go back to my analogy, it has very good roads and very good drivers. Now, there is a counterindication even in good countries. So Patrick is from Ireland. Ireland is another country which has good roads and good drivers and good everything, and it's a small open economy, but decided to fix the exchange rate. There are also good reasons when these things work to fix the exchange rate, because if you're in a highly integrated economic area, Ireland is part of the European Union, having a fixed exchange rate, and in fact, Ireland doesn't have a currency, it's part of the euro, so helps with trade, helps with economic integration. So in the standard model, the key benefit of a floating exchange rate regime is that it gives you a policy tool, which is valuable when you're hit by a shock. The key cost of a floating exchange rate regime is that makes trade a little bit more difficult because it creates a little bit of difficulties. So this is for countries like Switzerland and Ireland, two small open economies with, strong institution, high credibility, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem with Lebanon is that, you more have a forest than a nice road. So the country, just went through the worst economic crisis, I think, and financial crisis ever observed in the world, which also has been going on for now 7 years, which is, it's huge. But even before the crisis, the country never had a floating exchange rate. It was always this fix, which was not credible. So what is the problem? When you pretend to float, because remember that if you're gone, sorry, I'm talking about Lebanon already, but if you're gone on the IMF list, Lebanon was not characterized as a country with a fixed exchange rate. It was characterized as a country with a managed float. But yet the exchange rate was 1,525, whatever it is, for a very long time.
After the 90s, you mean?
Yeah, after the 90s, yes.
Yeah.
So the point is that, so I agree with Ibrahim that it would be nice to aspire to a floating exchange rate because of this flexibility. But can we get there? Or we're trying to use a car to drive through a forest. So that's the main thing. When you don't have the credibility that you need, a floating exchange rate regime is very costly. And not a hard fix is even costlier because it's not credible.
Very good. So, I mean, credibility and flexibility, these are the key words, right? The fix, just to summarize, the fix buys you credibility and also smoother capital inflows, as we've seen. But the cost is you're giving up monetary policy as a shock absorber.
Can I add just something?
Right?
It's like the super fix give you credibility, because remember that the Lebanese exchange rate was not credible. There was always interest rate on liras were always higher than interest rate on dollars. That was an indication that the fix was not fully credible.
And the float buys you that shock absorber back, but you have the shock absorber, but here too, you need to have the institutions behind it.
Correct.
For it to be trusted. So which side matter really depends a lot on the Lebanese specificities, on shocks, on institutions, and on what it wants to build in the future. And so now we move back to Ibrahim to put Ibrahim, if you can make the case for flexibility, so that we start with that, then we look at weaknesses and we look at what fix can do. But how does a flexible exchange rate fit into Lebanon's need to build a new productive economy? When we realize that the old system of capital inflows is dead, and that unless you have a productive economy that is export based, we're not going to get back at the kind of standards of living that we had or more. What is the place for a flexible exchange rate there, and how to make it work, actually? What would it take to make it work?
Well, it's going to take a lot of work. So I think Ugo mentioned...
Is it essential first?
I think it would be for an economy like Lebanon. The first reason is that we can aspire to have a monetary policy that is independent, that is targeting inflation or even the price level, and build credibility around such a monetary policy regime. So it would allow more, if you wish, independence in terms of conduct of monetary policy. But before we get there, I think, the reason for a flexible exchange rate regime, the rationale would be you would make your tradable sector, so I'm thinking here economic theory, Balassa Samuelson, you would make your tradables more competitive, right? You can absorb shocks and not run into the temptation that we've had right before the 2019 crisis, which is let's throw everything at preserving the peg, which is a very, very dangerous policy alternative, right? As we come to realize when the banking sector became insolvent. So we have been very much, as Nada mentioned, psychologically attached to the peg, We don't have to be, right? So we can make our tradables more competitive. We can make our tourism more competitive, which is our main export to the world. And all of that would be very beneficial to the country. We can perhaps even see a world in which Lebanon has smaller, I'm not saying surpluses, but at least smaller current account deficits year in, year out, because our current account deficits have been huge in the past years, even post-crisis. So that tells you something about shock absorption, that tells you something about import levels, about export competitiveness. Now, a deeper question would be, I think, in my view, why haven't exports picked up? And I think this is a question that was posed by Nada at one point, right? So since we've experienced that massive depreciation, we haven't seen exports pick up. And one can question the rationale for a flexible exchange rate regime based on that observation. And this is, I think, one point that would be worthy for discussion.
Right. Nada, why would you think export? I mean, we're still within thinking about the flexible exchange rate. We'll come back to fix later. But why do you think export did not pick up, given the huge depreciation that happened? And that's the nominal depreciation. What happened to the real exchange rate? If you can explain also what is a real exchange rate, please.
Sure. So basically, if you think about the nominal currency, it's the relative price of local currency to foreign, right? What's the price of a dollar in terms of local currency? But when you export and what contributes to aggregate demand, what that depends on is the relative price of your goods. So the price of goods relative to foreign. So you don't care only about the currency, the exchange rate, but you care about the prices as well, the foreign and the domestic prices. So for example, there's a common index, the Big Mac index, not because Big Macs are special, but just because there's data on that collected by the Economist magazine for a long time. And so you can use that to compare relative prices of goods across countries for a uniform tradable, it's not really tradable, but the components are mostly tradable. And so essentially when there is a currency crisis, or when monetary policy is expansionary and wants to use its exchange rate channel. So it's not only during crises, but the idea is that the exchange rate depreciates the nominal, and because prices are sticky, so the prices of wages and rents and the beef and the bread that goes into the Big Mac don't adjust immediately, you're going to have a relative change of the price of the goods domestic to the foreign. And that's going to induce an increase in exports, reduce imports, increase aggregate demand, and stimulate the economy. And so this is an adjustment mechanism both during crises when there's a big hit to the economy, and to recover from the crisis, in the evidence across many articles is that or when there's a terms of trade shock, any type of real shock, there's some adjustment by the exchange rate, a depreciation, and then that causes an increase, especially after large depreciations, a large export boom, and then increase the recovery out of the crisis. And these export booms are also associated, I think Patrick would know more in the case of Ireland, with like FDI inflows as well to countries like Ireland, where there's, taking advantage of the cost differences and the productivity, the low, domestic asset prices to set up new greenfield investment and so on. And that also leads to more exports. So in Lebanon, so that was the expectation 7 years ago, that we saw this large depreciation, and we should have seen a large real depreciation in terms of the goods. And we did see a little bit initially. So in 2020, 21, you see it in the overall price index and the overall price real exchange rate, but you also see it for maybe non-economists. It's easier to think about this Big Mac example again. So before the crisis, the Big Mac in Lebanon was a little bit less than the US price, just because of income differences, the Balassa Samuelson that Ibrahim was talking about. But essentially, it was quite high relative to similar income countries. at the peak of the crisis in 2021, you could buy the Lebanese Big Mac at the lowest price worldwide. So it went down to around $1.30. But it rebounded very quickly. By 2022, Turkey and Jordan had cheaper, Big Macs. And you see it over also that same trend in the overall real exchange rate. The overall real exchange rate took a bit longer to adjust, but by now they're both basically back to what it was initially. So it took longer because there's more non-tradables in the economy, like education shows up in the CPI index, rents, all these things are larger components, and it takes time for those to adjust. But overall, I would say that the adjustment in Lebanon, the price adjustment, happened a lot faster than comparable emerging market economies. And so what's the reason for that? So what we call it in international is there's a very high pass-through from the nominal exchange rate to prices. And so when there is that really high pass-through, the economic actors, people in the economy are basically offsetting any of that beneficial real depreciation by taking counter measures. And so what's going on behind that, right? Everyone is indexing to dollar. They want their wages. They compare them in dollars. They also compare them to pre-crisis. They compare prices in dollars. And you see it not just in Lebanon. People like to have real high wages in dollar terms. Sorry, I'm talking maybe too long, but
yeah. No, that's I think it's a very well. So
okay.
basically, to summarize, Nada, you're saying the flexible exchange rate doesn't really play its role as flexible in Lebanon because it doesn't manage to change relative prices because people think in terms of dollars.
Yes,
So
I mean
this is
it's a
a fair
necessary.
criticism.
It's a condition. It's one of this. It's a condition, but it's not actually. It's neither necessary nor sufficient, right? So you can get that real exchange rate depreciation through price adjustment, and this goes back to Friedman in the 50s, right? And we saw it in Greece and Ireland, where they stayed in the euro, but prices adjusted, and it was painful. So their prices adjusted downward.
Right.
In Lebanon, we had the opposite. So in other countries like Mexico, whatever, you get the nominal depreciation, prices take time to adjust. So you get the adjustment through the nominal exchange rate. In Lebanon, you neither got it either way because prices,
Okay.
will
So
compare.
basically, the exchange rate, the flexible didn't play the role of adjusting prices. They have to adjust in real time. So that's one weakness of flexible exchange rate. Let's take a bit more other type of weaknesses, Patrick. Before Rahim, I'm going to come back to you and see if you have any counterpoint as to these weaknesses. It seems that the flexible is not playing its role. Patrick, from your experience, I mean, there are other areas in which a flexible rate is weak or destructive. When you have external debt, we speak of fear of floating, balance sheet currency mismatches become very problematic when you have devaluation. Economists talk about time inconsistency. The fear of devaluation create problems today. Can you please tell us about this so we have a better feel for the risks actually of having too much flexibility?
One way of thinking about this is our policymakers going to hesitate before bringing in a flexible exchange rate? And then on the other hand, how about the private sector or the ordinary economic agents? Are they going to hesitate before they move out of their dollars into a new floating currency? And actually, to be honest, although there are serious issues around that, I think maybe a flexible exchange rate is often over-criticized on those dimensions relative to a peg. Let me take the policymakers. The policymakers are, you hear the term fear of floating, which you mentioned. It's particularly in Latin America. Many countries, they say, oh, well, maybe we should be devaluing, but we don't want to devalue because, why? Because the government is indebted in dollars, because many of the corporate sector are indebted in dollars, and we're afraid that they'll be wiped out in a situation, as no doubt you have seen in Lebanon in this recent episode, 2019 episode. Now, it does mean that in a floating regime, if you got there, people would have to be very careful about not exposing themselves to unhedged positions. Like if you're going to borrow in dollars to get a lower interest rate, that's a very foolish thing to do if there could be a sharp exchange rate movement. So the idea of not having open and exposed positions would have to come right into business decisions and to some extent government decisions. But you can overstate this. For example, I've seen countries, certainly including in the region. I look at Egypt, for example, where governments have become kind of frozen for fear that, you know, if we devalue, the local currency value of our external debt is going to go up. But the government is depending on tax receipts from the economy at large to pay for that external debt. And if the economy at large is being squeezed by being uncompetitive with a too high exchange rate that has not been devalued, then the government won't be able to service the debt. So you can exaggerate the problem of unhedged borrowings. So that's a kind of optical illusion. So that's an argument really saying that maybe policymakers shouldn't be too nervous about the floating and the impact on indebtedness, though they've got to be careful. But on the other side, when it comes to the ordinary agents in the economy, if they see a floating exchange rate, they're going to say, well, I'm not going to have any of that stuff because it's floating around. I prefer to stay with the dollars. And that's a difficult question. They certainly would be hesitant. And that's one of the reasons that I said at the beginning, probably you're wasting your time trying to do this too quickly. But in the longer term, it's likely, in my view, that a flexible exchange rate would become more credible, gradually become more credible, because it doesn't set a target for speculators. And that's what so many countries that have fixed pegs for periods of time, they see, oh, we fixed the peg, oh, full confidence, but no, 30% devaluation, 50% devaluation, that a peg is only a peg until it collapses. And obviously Lebanon is a prime example, but it's not the only example. And I think that a target peg is going to be a very difficult one to persuade the ordinary economic agents of, relative to, here we're going to operate our fiscal policy, our monetary policy in a sensible way, but we're not going to guarantee an exchange rate. It's going to move around in the market. We may intervene. You call it a dirty float. I don't like that. I think you call it a managed float. There are reasons for intervening. Switzerland does intervene from time to time, but a managed float could become a lot more credible over time, but not in the next year or two.
What do you think, Hugo, of what Patrick just said? I mean, there is also the risk that with the dirty float, you don't get the benefit of the fix, and you don't get enough of the benefit of the flexible. I mean, that could describe the situation in which we are today. We are in a fix that could change tomorrow. It's a dirty float, as you said initially. And some argue that the high inflation that we have comes from the fact that there is a fear of a devaluation, and that this by itself produces what Nada was talking about, an overvaluation of the real exchange rate that makes us even less competitive. Isn't it risky to be neither here nor there?
Yes, and that's why I'm in favor of a hard peg. By the way, when we were talking, my friend Clemens Graf von Luckner would co-author the Lebanon paper, the Harvard Lebanon paper with me, sent me a very nice graph showing what happens to inflation after exchange rate stabilizations. And his graph shows that hard peg inflation converges to zero or converges to the anchor much faster than in non-hard pegs, which is exactly what you were saying, Isaac. In a sense, if you have a super credible fix, the overvaluation goes away faster, in a sense. So which is why I think Lebanon should adopt a super hard peg, exactly for the reason you said.
Ibrahim, I'm building up towards arguments that you would refute, right? So take note. Patrick, you wanted to add?
The term super hard peg, yeah, but it needs to be something like we don't have a currency. You
Yes.
can't say nobody is ever going to say, "Oh, my peg is super hard." Oh no, tomorrow it's not super hard. It has to be fixed in constitution or in law, or it just you don't have your currency.
Yeah, that's
You wanna,
exactly. That's why I said I would go the El Salvador or Ecuador or Panama way.
so you bide your hands not to have floating in the future, basically. Now, two issues then. I mean, you either pick the dollar, but then you're at the hand of the Fed. I mean, they could these days put sanctions on it, but you don't want to talk politics, but this is in the world in which we live, this is an issue of national interest and security. And since we're at it, would you go for a currency board? That's a commitment. And at least we get an interest out of the money in circulation as of the reserves, as opposed to just having dollars with not earning you any interest. Would you go that far?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
No.
No.
And I tell you, in fact, this is a very nice example of what Nada said before, that same question with different answers. Now, if you had asked me this question 28 years ago, so it's a long time,
Yeah.
I would have said yes. I would have said that the currency board is credible enough. It gives you a little bit of senior age, but having seen the miserable end of the Argentinian currency board, I'm actually now convinced that the currency board is as fragile as any other peg, which doesn't go the extreme way mentioned by Patrick before, which is simply adopting the currency of another country.
But haven't we seen countries adopt the dollar and then reverse? I mean, is that any commitment that is unbeatable?
I mean, you can always do anything. There are countries which split in two. So, I mean, the Czechoslovakia split into countries. So I assume
It's a
that,
matter of degree, you mean?
splitting a country in two, it's easier but it's clearly much harder to recreate a currency after you ditched it. So it's feasible, but everything is feasible in the world.
Can I add just a point there on the currency board? Ireland had a currency board shortly after it broke away from Britain in 1921, and it had it for 25 years. But it's a bit of a fake. The currency board is a kind of a pretend thing, because it says, well, we look after your currency notes and we'll back them one for one with, in that case, British currency notes. In this, maybe it should be US dollar or euro notes. But for the banks, no, don't worry about the banks. They're very well run. They're sensible. We don't pay any attention to banks. We don't even have a central bank. That's what a currency board is. Now, I'm sorry, but the banks are where it's at nowadays. It's not the currency notes, it's the banks. So it's a kind of fake to say, oh, we've solved this problem with the currency board. You haven't.
Got you. No, good point. So where are we now? Brahim, good to go back to you, because you're not only a proponent of the flexible rate, you're also a critic of the peg. So what do you respond to these advantages?
No, I mean, they're excellent arguments. One cannot refute them. But just by thinking about the fixed exchange rate regime, I believe it outlived its usefulness to Lebanon. I always compare the 1980s to the period right before the 2019 financial crisis. So, for example, in the 80s, you had a devaluation without a massive systemic banking crisis, right?
Massive devaluation.
And a massive devaluation without a banking insolvency, right? So without having a commercial banking sector that's completely insolvent. So if we are to go with the proposals being made by Patrick, Ugo, and Nada, one has to essentially ask why that is and what can we do differently to end up with a scenario that is unlike 2019 and more like the 1980s. But just to go back to Nada's points, I mean, I don't think the period that she mentioned right after the crisis it's a nice natural experiment to see, I mean, how useful a flexible exchange rate would be. But the World Bank has written about this, that period. So they call that the lack of an external lift in the basically during the crisis. And one reason is potentially COVID, right? So the entire global economy was hit by COVID in 2020. So there was a lack of demand for imports and from every country in the world. So Lebanon couldn't export much. And then also we don't have, and I think Ugo mentioned this, neither the institutional setup yet, nor the, more importantly, I think the business enabling environment and the language of the World Bank again. So what basically would allow you to have competitiveness, right? So if you're operating in a world in which you have rolling blackouts and electricity priced at 60 cents, per kilowatt, and essentially anything you win from a devaluation, you'd lose on your costs, which are now exorbitant. So it's not a, I think, fair natural experiment for the flexible exchange rate regime. So when I said, maybe we should aspire to go there, first of all, let's fix, electricity, the business enabling environment, transport, everything that has to do, even connectivity to the internet, everything else, right? Have a setup, improve our institutions, and then try having a flexible exchange rate regime. In my view, today, we don't even have we have maybe what we can call a de facto peg, but nobody is really using the Lebanese currency, to be honest. Like it's a de facto dollarization. That would be the more, I think, apt characterization of what we have, because everybody operates, all businesses, the private sector, the public sector, every economic agent operates, except for paying taxes, and not all of them, by the way, except for a few taxes and small bills here and there. Nobody uses the domestic currency anymore. So we are de facto dollarized for that matter.
So maybe that's the argument of the other part of the room, right? Is we're effectively dollarized, and it's going to be very hard for the Lebanese pound to become credible, to build trust in good institution, in this policy, in a good policy framework. But isn't that what we're aspiring to? I mean, if we say, okay, we'll accept dollarization, can we still, in a coherent way, think that we can actually build a growing economy, an export-led model? And if we think we can build good policies, do we also think at the same time that therefore we can have a flexible exchange rate that helps us adjust shocks? Are these two view coherence, basically? Are you assuming the other part of the room that we cannot have good policies? We need to live in a universe of policy pessimism, and dollarization is kind of the least cost strategy in that world. Is that the conclusion? Or is it different? Maybe what you're all saying, is that actually the regime doesn't matter. What matters is that within each regime, that the complementary policies, that the rules be followed, at least, that regime be credible. And at the end of the day, if the exchange rate doesn't adjust, prices can adjust. So it's not the end of the world. The worst case is when we have a flexible, and we use that to expropriate bondholders, or we have a fix and we don't change course when the course is clearly unsustainable, as happened in the past. So let me take a round and take your views on this kind of a second opinion. Is it pessimism or is it coherence that is kind of leading you? Let's go, Ugo.
Okay. So two things. What it matters, so Nada explained it very well. What it matters is the real exchange rate for economic performance. And the real exchange rate can move because the nominal exchange rate moves, or because relative prices move. Now, the reason why we think a flexible exchange rate is good is because prices move slowly, the nominal exchange rate can move quickly, so when we have a shock, we can adjust. However, over the long run, prices move. Now, in Lebanon, the exchange rate was fixed for 25 years. And the fact that it remained overvalued, it cannot be blamed to the exchange rate. Over a 25-year period, it could adjust. So it's very hard for me to think that the fundamental competitiveness problem of Lebanon is driven by the exchange rate. It must be driven by something else. So again, Patrick, Ireland is the most successful European economy. It went through a massive crisis, like massive financial crisis. It came out like a lion, not like a tiger, the Celtic tiger. And it has a fixed exchange rate. And Hong Kong, it's an incredibly successful economy. It has a fixed exchange rate. So I'm fully for floating exchange rate, but floating exchange rate allows you to deal with temporary shocks. It's not going to solve a fundamental long-run competitiveness problem. So I think Ibrahim is right in saying that what happened around COVID is a bit unfair because there are all these things. But what about the previous 25 years when the exchange rate remained massively, the real exchange rate remained massively overvalued? Prices should have adjusted. They never did.
Electricity prices never did.
Yeah.
And right now, capital is very scarce. We have fundamental problems to solve before it can be competitive. Wages alone, I think, will not adjust. Patrick, as you think of your question, let me just tell participants you've been very patient. We're coming closer to the end of this discussion, and we're gonna hear your questions. So start typing them on the chat box, and we're gonna come to them soon. Patrick?
One thing that I think worth bearing in mind, over the whatever is 30, 35, whatever number of years of the fixed exchange rate, it wasn't really that Lebanese exports were becoming uncompetitive because of a price issue. The collapse of the currency was not restoring competitiveness to us, and it was to do with default. It was to do with people scrambling to get their money out when they realized that stuff was not going to be paid. It had to do with asset prices. And that leads, though, to two dimensions looking forward. I mean, I think what Ugo is hinting at is there's something other than prices that is required in Lebanon to generate an export capacity and to bring Lebanon back into a higher income level. Before, for many, many years, the big export sector was the banking, which was attracting business from all over the region. And it was and now it's gone, and it's not easy to see that it will come back in an export-oriented way. So building all sorts of non-financial, non-monetary structures that can deal with the modern economy, that's what's needed. That's what, in a way, was in Ireland. Of course, there are tax dimensions as well, and American companies. There's lots of complications in that story, which is not easy to reproduce in Lebanon. And for sure, the security issues around Lebanon at present militate against that sort of development. There's no doubt about that. But there is another dimension to this as well, and this question of competitiveness that Ibrahim has pointed to, that there's still some use of the Lebanese currency. I mean, some people are being paid in Lebanese currency, some taxes are being paid in it. And although the rate at which these Lebanese pounds can be exchanged for dollars is 89,500 for more than 2 years, the inflation rate has been far higher than it is in the US or in any other dollar-related countries. It was apparently 19% in the last year, 15% the year before that. It was higher before that again. So I think there can be maybe small, maybe not big problems, but there is a problem of the way the current nearly fully dollarized situation is being operated. And it could cause disruptions, particularly for low-income people who are probably more dependent on the Lebanese pound. And I think that should be watched, because this sort of peg, it's not really a peg because you can't transact at it unless you satisfy certain criteria, some proportion of your salary and all that, it's the approval from the central bank. But there are problems starting to emerge, I think, in that area.
let's follow up on this, take two last interventions, Nada and then Ibrahim, and kind of focus a bit more on, the current situation and looking into the future. Nada, it seemed to me you were more positive about the value of a fixed exchange rate gives us stability. Would you go as far as to say, as we engage into reforms, into fixing the banking system, the electricity sector, of course, security, that actually the fixed exchange rate for now is a good environment to engage in these other reforms? Would you go as far as argue this? And then I have two other questions for both of you and Ibrahim. One is about who decides. I mean, with an independent central bank, who decides actually? And this is an institutional question. And how do we ensure basically cooperation between the central bank and say the fiscal in an environment where the central bank is independent? And finally, I want also some comments, if not from you, from Brahim, about the current situation where we see the real exchange rate appreciating. There is more inflation domestically than internationally, and yet, this is kind of a cost of the fixed exchange rate, and it is requiring fiscal surpluses to stabilize. It seems costly from that perspective. Is this an okay situation, or is it unsustainable? So I mean, I want to close with comments around these points. Nada?
So many questions there. I'll leave the last one to
Uh,
Ibrahim. I think
you can take as many as you like. You stay
I
within,
think I
five,
think
six minutes.
your second question I wasn't exactly clear about. It seems short. So just to clarify, an independent central bank does not mean there is no oversight from the government. So in the US, the Federal Reserve is independent, at least last time we checked, current policy with the Trump administration. But let's say it's an independent central bank. That doesn't mean the mandate. So the objective of the central bank to have in the US price stability, which means low and stable inflation and maximum employment, those two objectives are not determined by the Fed. They are determined by Congress or Parliament, right? Government. The Fed has to meet those objectives, and there's ways through oversight and so on. And Brahim was mentioning before when we talked last time about the governance. But I mean, so independent monetary policy is about how do you conduct monetary policy, use the inflation targeting strategy, for example, and so on. But the objectives you're meeting are not the central bank decides on its own, right? So in the case of Lebanon, this should be agreed on by, there should be public buy-in, as I said at the beginning, and the public buy-in comes from government and from parliament and so on, the representatives, right? It's not about the central bank. The central bank then has to meet those objectives. So whether it's fixed exchange rate, whether it's flexible, so that's achievable, right? It's just we have to decide as a country which one to go down. In terms of your earlier question about policies, so let me just clarify, since this might be the last time I say. So I'm in favor of fixing in the short run, like to medium run, right? But the idea is, and I think this was echoed by many people, including Ibrahim, right? Once inflation is under control and people have regained some confidence, so the whole underlying thing is people currently do not have any confidence. The central bank is not credible. If it were to say we're going to do, price stability objective and we're going to do it using strategy of inflation targeting, nobody's going to believe that. They're still going to look at what is the dollar wage, the dollar price, and so on. But once, if there is, and it's a big if, right? If there is good policy for some time, I think it's a very good idea to transition then to a more flexible exchange rate, right? And to try to do it in tranquil times, not when there's a next crisis hits. So, for the many reasons we said before, they're more prone fixed exchange rates to speculative attacks. So try to transition. If you can try to get people on board over time, that would be, a very good policy. Now, in terms of reforms, the good news here is whether it's fixed or whether it's flexible, a lot of these policy reforms that have been associated with success are across, across all types of regimes. So, if we want to learn lessons from other countries, we don't need to say, well, that one only applies to Estonia that went down a fixed exchange rate. And so the bottom line here, I would say, just to be brief, is, yeah, Ugo was mentioning Argentina. Yes, Argentina had a currency board. It ended in disaster, but so did Estonia, right? And it ended up in a really good situation. Okay, they, entered the euro, but Hong Kong, for example, continues to have a currency board. And, within dollarization, even Panama, that has been dollarized for over a century. They've had many IMF programs. Ecuador had a default. So basically, like, whether you're fixed, whether you're flexible, you can have bad or good performance. So what has been associated with the good performance, and especially in a country like Lebanon where there is no credibility, is you need more rules rather than discretion, right? So for example, in the fiscal side, you need more fiscal rules, you need limits, even though it comes at the cost of not being able to, do fiscal policy as easily countercyclically. But the idea is, this by having a responsible fiscal policy that's sustainable, that isn't shifting the burden to future generations, that brings down the cost of borrowing, it enables businesses to borrow more easily, and that helps them also from, so Ibrahim was talking about all these costs, electricity, that's another thing government can do, infrastructure, right? So instead of just balancing the budget, try to shift more to capital expenditure, try to, lower electricity prices, lower transport costs, and that also encourages exports and the product. So my bottom line here is, even if the exchange rate channel is turned off due to Lebanese people's, strong pass-through but it doesn't mean we have to revert to this rentier economy. There are ways to get a productive sector going through these other measures, right? Infrastructure, spending, safe and sound financial system, safe and sound central bank. And again, here it would be not discretion, not allowing the central bank to, set, guidance and so on. No, to have explicit limits early on capital, which we don't see in the banking sector, liquidity, a lot more higher foreign liquidity. Going back to Brahim's question, why didn't it fail in the 80s? Because banks were holding a lot more dollar liquidity then. And so same thing for the central bank. There should be concentration limits and so on. We could go on, right?
Yes.
But basically, in addition to infrastructure, in addition to lowering borrowing costs overall, one thing, like the example of the pharmaceutical sector, is really interesting. So after the financial crisis, now there was some FDI, especially in the pharmaceutical sector. So, and then it kind of fizzled out. So, what can we do to encourage these more, right? So one question I had to someone was, well, why don't they export? Why aren't they, and they're like, well, they don't have international standards, certification. So this is something that can easily be, set up by the government, facilitated, right? So, same thing for, incubators and so on. And the last thing I would say is, competitiveness, which is, of all, of the sectors, brings up productivity. So people who demand these high wages, if there really is higher productivity from more competition, that can sustain it. So the idea is ultimately to try to reconcile the high real wages with the external balance and so on, to try to get them more in line. Final thing I saw, a very interesting point. I don't know how applicable this is to Lebanon, but I was reading the literature. So Calvo and Michigan, they had an interesting proposal. They said, even if the fixed exchange rate doesn't adjust and you don't get that price adjustment in a fixed exchange rate, they said you can still use like uniform import taxes and uniform export subsidies. Although I would be careful because it's, probably prone to, political, corruption. But there are ways to explicitly use fiscal taxation and subsidies to try to encourage exports and try to get the recovery. So I think those are, yeah.
Thank you. Ibrahim, what do you want to say perhaps about the current regime in which we are? How useful it is for the current situation? And then we have some questions in the chat box that I'm going to start distributing to you.
Well, to start with your first question about who should decide, I believe that the government should decide because it's mostly a political decision. And as Nada suggested, the central bank would carry out whatever mandate is being asked that the institution is being asked to carry out. Now, the current regime.
Can I push you another on this? I mean, in the past, we had, I don't know what was the official strategy, but clearly the central bank used a lot of reserve and financial engineering to protect a fixed exchange rate. Was that a government decision or not? Was the general rule that you described, Nada, that this has to be government policy actually respected? It's a bit of a historical question, but it's good to
Well,
try to understand a little bit the
well,
working
I
of
mean,
the system.
I think Ugo was correct. Like officially to the IMF, we never said our exchange rate policy was fixed. It was managed, stabilized, or something, stabilized arrangement. Um, but let's say, effectively de facto it was fixed. If you have a fixed exchange rate, the central bank has to therefore, I mean, if that is its mandate, then they give up monetary policy and they're only they have to then defend that peg. So when people want to sell the domestic currency, they have to be willing to buy it and provide them with dollars. And as part of that, central banks lose foreign exchange reserves. So that's why, central banks under fixed exchange rates have to hold higher
Sure.
dollar liquidity buffers, right? Even Bank of England in 92 lost, several billion, maybe 70 billion in a few hours, right? Defending their peg to the Deutschmark. So it's not uncommon. The financial engineering and all that, shifting the dollar liquidity from the banks and in a not very transparent way, that was maybe more special to the Lebanese case. But once your mandate is to have a fixed exchange rate, then that is the objective of the central bank above all else is to maintain that. So not price stability, not maximum employment. And we saw actually inflation was quite volatile during the fixed exchange rate period and growth was volatile. So, I mean, you know,
Is this clear to everyone that this was a government decision to fix and the central bank was just delivering on that mandate by any means necessary? Because there's a different narrative also in town. I mean, maybe we don't know the answer, but this is just interesting here
I
as
mean, I don't know in the case of Lebanon, but in general,
yeah,
the mandate should come
yeah,
from
yeah,
the
no, no, no.
government, and
Case
then
of Lebanon, case
yeah,
of Lebanon.
in the agent who implements it is the central bank. The mandate should come from the government, right?
No, but I think once
Okay.
you have a policy in place, it's incredibly difficult to move away from it. So once you have the peg, you're gonna always tend to defend it, right? This is what we learned from the Bank of England. This is what we learned. But I mean, those institutions like Bank of England versus Soros, those institutions eventually know when to sort of abdicate and say, well, this is it. Um, it's not clear that in a country like Lebanon, with the institutional setup that we have, we would know to just basically stop defending the peg. Um, so, but I mean, there are other very interesting questions I think posed by Ugo. So and by you, Ishaq. So, in terms of the prices, right? Well, I believe that we need to look at the market structures in Lebanon. That deserves a lot of attention. I think the lack of competition explains a lot of the stickiness and elevated prices. I do not believe that we have a proper understanding of how concentrated our market structures are. And that deserves attention because it's going to affect the aggregate price level, right? So not just at the industry level, but even more at the aggregate level. So that could be one explanation, right? We see a de facto, let's call it fixed or fixed exchange rate, and yet we see an inflation which is higher than what you see in the US, for example. On your last question, I think the current arrangement is working. Let me just elaborate on this again. The World Bank has written extensively on this. So fiscal sterilization. So we are able to maintain this peg because essentially on the fiscal side, we're able to collect more revenue. So tax compliance has improved, tax collections have improved. And as a result of that, there's less currency in circulation. The central bank can build up reserves and manage currency in circulation at the same time and preserve the peg. And then re-inject, whenever there's a need to re-inject dollars into the economy, the central bank can do that. Now, at the current level of reserves is, quite good. After the conflict, there has been some drawdown of reserves, so starting February 28, but then they went back up. So all in all, it seems to be sustainable to the extent that on the fiscal side, collection and compliance continue to improve. So this is it's a fiscal-driven story.
Right. Very good. So, I mean, you'll conclude at the end, tell us if you change your priors, but I see kind of a lot of support for keeping fixed stable as we can, as we stabilize in the short term, with maybe some discussion about the usefulness of the flexible in the future if several conditions hold in terms of rebuilding competitiveness in other ways and rebuilding trust and credibility so that we don't have inflation, printing money suddenly, which by the way didn't happen in Lebanon. I mean, that is not necessarily the big problem. Let's shift to the questions. There is a question from Rabia Taous, sorry, excuse me for mispronouncing your name, from the central bank. And basically it's about if we have a fixed exchange rate, then we import interest rate shocks from the rest of the world, and that's a weakness. And is this a weakness that we can do nothing about, or does it militate for actually a more sovereign position with a flexible rate where we don't have to just import the interest rate from the rest of the world? That's one question. Let me put another question on the table, then you can pick the one you want to answer. Okay. The other question is about the capital account. We didn't speak about the capital account. So this is, obviously is being critical for Lebanon, and because of remittances, there is pressure to keep the capital account open. And what implications does that have for the choice of exchange rate, if I'm reading the question right? So take your pick. We have two questions on the table. Who is interested in answering one of them?
Well, I just offered
Patrick.
a very brief answer to both of them and see if others agree. Yeah, sure. The dollar interest rate, where the Fed wants to raise interest rates, which doesn't seem very likely just at the moment, but that will pass through. But actually, funding conditions will also be affected for floating currencies in that environment as well. And there's a lot of evidence, more than I thought this would go away, but it hasn't gone away. There's still a dominance of the US financial market conditions on financial market conditions, all over the world, at least in the countries that are freely trading. So you won't escape it by floating exchange rate. On the capital inflows and the remittances, the only thing I would say there is I think it's absolutely crucial to resolve this indebtedness problem. All of that needs to be fixed before anything is improved in the financial system. Who is going to take the hit? Who's going to pay? Who's not going to pay? I know this has been discussed for 7 years, but it's too long. It has to be fixed, and obviously there are very strong interests at stake. Even the small people want to be paid, and they have votes, and the big people don't have votes, but they have influence. But it needs to be solved, and then you'll get your capital flows. But nobody is going to be keen on putting capital into a country where the last round of capital inflows has been defaulted.
Right. But I mean, at the same time, remittances are not FDI. You're absolutely right on FDI. but
But it's a
remittances
similar sort of story
flow,
that you're
will
sending money
flow.
to your family and you're afraid that it's going to be wiped out very quickly or something like that.
Right. So, I mean, the fear is that then, if the currency is artificially high and there is a risk of devaluation, that it will shift, the remittances would shift to an informal market, as has happened in Egypt, for example, repeatedly. And that, kind of obliges you to keep your capital account open, and then puts a lot of pressure and discipline over the system.
Can I add something quickly?
Yeah, please.
So this is an answer to Rabia from the central bank. I mean, I'm just going to repeat partly what Patrick said. But of course, I mean, a floating exchange rate, in theory, it really helps you when, you're hit by asymmetric shock vis-a-vis the anchor currency, because, if you're hit by the same shock, then you don't care, because your optimal policy is the same policy of the country you're anchoring in. So, somebody's doing the work for you. So that's where, in theory, works. But as Patrick said, research, especially by Helen Ray, who is going to be the new chief economist of the Bank for International Settlement, showed indeed that even having a floating exchange rate, her paper is titled Dilemma, Not Trilemma, that even having a floating exchange rate regime doesn't fully allow you to conduct because an independent policy, because the dollar is so important in the financial system.
Okay, I think we're really gone around the issues quite well. Thank you for that. I am not sure how to summarize. We looked at the pros and cons of fixed, flexible, and dollarization as well. Received support. The only proposal that didn't seem to receive any support is the currency board. And I think in all cases, you show that there are pros and cons, actually, and that it's not necessarily the most crucial decision, given all the other problems that need to be resolved. Perhaps we take 1 minute from each to close. We have one more question. Excuse me. How did having multiple different dollar rates, affect the economy? I mean, that was the case, that we had many different exchange rates. I don't think anybody would defend that. And to what extent does full dollarization strip the central bank of monetary policy tools? I think I will address especially this last question to Ibrahim. You've argued, I remember once, that actually stripping if I remember your argument correctly, that it'd be good if the central bank focuses a little bit more on monetary policy and a little bit less on regulating banks. Is that the argument you developed once?
No, I think, I mean, having a greater focus on the conduct of monetary policy would be certainly beneficial, and not in the sense of what we call quasi-fiscal operations. So our central bank tried to stimulate the economy prior to the crisis by having stimulus packages mostly directed to real estate. So that's not what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of more like a Fed-like central bank or a European central bank, in which basically the conduct of monetary policy is to anchor inflation and inflation expectations. And that would require, I think, additional resources to be devoted to that rather than bank regulation, right? Now, I think that the regulatory landscape is very complex. There has been a recent governance diagnostic published by the IMF, which discusses this in a lot of detail, because you have multiple entities regulating the financial sector, and they eventually all fall under the central bank government. So I think, I mean, there's a lot of regulation to be done by the central bank. So having less of that and more independence for these entities and more focus on the conduct of monetary policy, because once you fix your exchange rate, there's really little you're doing in terms of monetary policy other than just fixing or maintaining, accumulating reserves and trying to maintain that peg. That's all you do. That's the monetary policy that you're conducting. So having more independence in monetary policy for me would be a good thing, and less focus on regulation and more delegation to the different regulatory bodies that fall under the central bank currently.
Again, as a medium to long-term aspiration, I take it.
Everything. So I think we have a question in the chat as to whether we should be even talking about the exchange rate. I think this is an excellent question. So the question is more about, should we restructure the banking sector, fix the business enabling environment, and do everything else, and then talk about the exchange rate? Yes, short answer is I fully agree. We should be fixing everything else, and then as I said, it's an aspirational goal to get to a flexible exchange rate regime at the end of the day.
True. But the last question still is nagging us. I mean, it's costly to maintain the peg right now. It's taking fiscal surpluses at a time where state revenues are, many-fold smaller than what is needed. How sustainable is this? Is the cost of the peg worth paying for it? I guess. Nada, is this a question you'd be interested in responding to? Is the cost of stability worth paying to with very scarce fiscal resources right now?
Is this the anonymous attendee question?
I don't know if that is the last one.
Okay, because there's another question now. But anyway, yeah, so I mean, I agree. It is I think a lot of these countries did sacrifice. So Estonia, they suffered through several painful recessions at the cost of maintaining that peg, and they had to run a balanced budget because they couldn't get financing. If you ask them, it was worth it, right? They joined the euro. I mean, what's our end game? Where they have, fiscal transfers in the eurozone and they have the European Central Bank. I mean, our end game isn't really having that. It does tie with another question. So two things, just one more thing on that question. We look at the fiscal spending without looking at the revenue side. So yes, we have austerity now, or a hard budget constraint, but that's because yes, the taxes are going up and they're becoming more widely applied. But there's still a long way to go, and so I think there can be a lot more, you know, attention focused on a more fair taxation system to be able to do all the necessary spending, especially the public investment that is pretty much gone to nothing. And that's really crucial for future growth. So I don't see it as a trade-off. I see it more as something that people have to think about collectively, right? So some countries, they don't want to spend too much, others do. And, we have to decide. We're having such an austere budget currently with low taxes in relative terms, even if people don't see it that way, but it is low tax incident compared to other countries. In terms of, there was another question about the fix. I think I understood the capital account question was that without this exchange rate, their concern is that remittances and capital inflows, like such as into the dollar deposit accounts, which help support a lot of the private capital inflows, would not be as large. That's what I understood. So they were, I think, providing another reason to have a fixed exchange rate. I think that ties with the preference of the need to have the dollar, to have their assets and their in dollar terms that are so. Yeah, I mean, I think without currently having the confidence restored, if we do transition to a fully flexible, I mean, no country has a fully flexible. There's a recent article by Reinhardt and Drogoff and Ilzetsky that show that actually a lot of countries have some managed float, and they're accumulating a lot of foreign exchange reserves in the last 20 years to support that. So, yeah, I mean, I think policy, to summarize, you need to do these other reforms. You need to focus on how best to spend. You need to focus on the implications of imposing something on people that they don't want. So that can also cause a consumer confidence, business confidence issue in the short run. So try to get everyone on board. Do the policies that lead to, recovery, growth, and then over time, maybe we should rethink. So one last view I have is maybe don't go for such a, so, this is where I might disagree with Ugo that, maybe if we go down the route of complete dollarization or euro or whatever, it's hard to come back and maybe reassess, should we try to go to a more flexible, so at the cost of not gaining that, confidence fully. But anyway, so those are my last thoughts on this.
Thank you, Nada. Any last thoughts, Ugo, Patrick?
Can
Yeah. So Patrick will have the last word.
So first of all, let me say that, restate something that Nada said before. At the end, the economic success of a country, the currency regime matters relatively little. Having a good monetary policy helps you stabilize a little bit of the business cycle, but you can be very successful with a fixed exchange rate. Ireland is, Hong Kong is, can be very successful with a floating exchange rate. So at the end, what makes a country rich is not monetary policy or having a fixed or a floating exchange rate. It's all the good policies that can sustain this. However, having an exchange rate which is fixed and is not consistent with the policies of a fixed exchange rate can lead to massive disasters. And this, you have seen it in Lebanon. Now, for nerds like us who study currency crisis, they think about 3 generations of currency crisis model. The third generation, balance sheet effect. The second generation associated to Maury Osfeld, things could go well or could go bad, who knows, something. And then there is the first generation, the Krugman model. Things are going to go bad, and for sure are going to go bad because the policy is inconsistent with the fixed exchange rate. And this was Lebanon. Lebanon is not the second generation. The exchange rate had to collapse. It was inconsistent with the policies. Let me conclude with an anecdote. This is summer 2019. I went with my wife and a friend of my wife to Brumena. So, Brumena in the summer, everybody's partying, everybody's dancing on the table, everybody's drinking. It looks like you're in New York, like drinking, and there are Mercedes and BMW parks outside bars. And while we were driving down from Brumena, this friend of my wife told me, "So, Ugo, you think a crisis is coming?" And I said, "Yes, of course. I don't know when, but the crisis is coming for sure." And she told me, "Oh, you're always negative, this and that. We are not Argentina." And I told her, "Hulud, when the crisis comes, Argentina will look like Switzerland." And she told me, "Oh, you're always negative." And then 6 months after, she called me, and actually she called my wife, and she said, Ugo was right. So, that's the important thing. So whatever you did, and to me, at this stage, Lebanon has very, very little to gain from having a floating exchange rate or, a fix which is not fully credible. And that's why, with regret, I think they should dollarize. And when I say dollarize, this is something we don't discuss. It would work. One should decide what is the right anchor. There is a big discussion in the literature. Should you fix to the dollar? Should you fix to the euro? Should you fix to something else? And that's actually an important thing. But that's my concluding remark.
Thank you, Ugo. Patrick?
Yes, I don't have much to add. Dollar versus euro, for example, you look at the trading patterns, and at first it seems like the euro is winning in terms in Lebanon. But then you see there's a lot of trade with the Gulf, and the Gulf is sort of dollar area. So it swings backwards and forwards. But I think one thing you said at the beginning, Ishac, I think is very important, that during the period for years and years, not just running up to the crisis, for years and years, the interest rate on Lebanese pound deposits and therefore loans was much, much higher than the interest rate on dollars. And that's because it took that to persuade people to use Lebanese funds. So it's not really just going to be a question of fixed or floating. There'll be an interest rate impact. And if it's not a credible fix, there'll be quite a high interest rate penalty. And likewise, if it's not, if it's a float in an environment where people are not sure that they're ever going to get paid, there'll be a penalty as well. So that's worth thinking about in terms of the interest rate that would exist in an economy that has decided to push forward use of its own currency without the fundamental credibility requirements.
Right. Very well said. Thank you. Well, thank you all. I think it's time to close. I'd love to be able to say a few things, but I'm not too sure of what it is. I think there's clearly consensus for a fixed rate in the short term to continue to stabilize the situation and even to dollarize, which really means to live within very tight budget constraints. I think that's the bottom line at this stage. But there is still kind of a question of how you keep that system stable. And one question which should be the question for next seminar is what explained the high inflation rate and what kind of efforts are needed, in addition to the clear work on banking, on infrastructure. Why is it that this inflation has continued to be in the teens, close to 15%, and keep appreciating, or exchange rate doesn't matter at this stage? So there's that, and then there's the question of the medium term. Whether what is it we need in the medium term, and even further than that, what is the aspiration, the model for growth in the medium term, and what instruments would be required. I mean, clearly there's not yet enough thinking and discussion about that, and to think of a somewhat coherent plan and would be very important. And I think that would be the proper place for a debate on the medium term type of exchange rate regime that we would have, especially in a world that increasingly is prone to shocks. So I'll leave it at that. I want to thank you enormously for all the time you've devoted. I want to thank our participants for staying with us for an hour and a half when there's many good things to do in this summer day. So thanks again, and hope to see you all very soon.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Isaac.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ishac. Bye.